From the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it's rising, and have come to do him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For thus it has been written to the prophets, 'And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, since from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod called the Magi secretly and ascertained from them the time of the star's appearance. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word, that I too may go and do him homage." After their audience with the king, they set out. And behold, the star that they had seen at its rising preceded them, until it came and stopped over the place where the child was. They were overjoyed at seeing the star, and on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They prostrated themselves and did him homage. Then they opened their treasures and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their country by another way. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Good afternoon. As you notice, I don't have my glasses right now. I forgot my glasses in my rush coming here. So forgive me if I struggle through this mass reading and also trying to decipher the things that are in front of me. Anyway, back in the 1990s, I met a young Japanese my age who was visiting the Philippines. And when I met him, he told me that he just came from Palawan to look at our underground river. And I remember shamefacedly now how I responded to the news that he just came from Palawan to look at the underground river. I asked him, "What underground river?" And I realized that growing up in the national capital region, growing up in Manila, I Manila was the center of my world, and I never really stepped out of Manila until fairly late. And I never heard of the underground river during the time. There was no internet yet. I had no relations from Palawan, and so I wondered about the underground river. And I realized this was part of my ignorance growing up as a Filipino, growing up in the capital, with all my families coming from with all my family coming from the capital. I will have to admit, and I hope you bear with me, this was the time when I thought ang Pilipinas bulok. I thought we were such a terrible country that there was nothing to be proud about, and that everything else in the world was much better. In fact, I was once talking to a priest, and he was telling me that he always got excited every time he went to Manila International Airport and flew to any destination in the world, basta anywhere outside of the Philippines. It was exciting, and the excitement only disappeared when he was coming back to the Philippines. I realized that in my very small world when I was growing up, because I grew up in the capital, I was both arrogant and ignorant. A very, very terrible combination. I was both arrogant and ignorant when it came to anything about the Philippines, simply because I lived here all my life. In fact, there were times when I couldn't say nice things about the Philippines because I thought I knew everything about the Philippines growing up in the capital, when actually I really didn't. And the little that I knew about the Philippines, that ignorance, made me arrogant and judgmental with regard to our country. But when I started going around the Philippines, especially when I became a seminarian, when I entered the seminary, we would do missions and I would be assigned to different parts of the Philippines. I slowly changed my views on the Philippines and I began to really see how beautiful our country is. I mean, I've been to Coron several times, and for me, Coron is just one of the most gorgeous places on earth. I sometimes look at the movie Peter Pan, the Disney cartoon, and I wonder whether the Mermaid Lagoon in Peter Pan was inspired by Coron because it looks almost the same. And because as a seminarian and as a missionary, I was assigned to different places in the Philippines, I slowly realized how wonderful of all things our greatest treasure really is our kababayans, our fellow Filipinos. They are some of the sweetest, some of the nicest people on earth. It took some time for me to get to this point as a Filipino. And I had to deliberately travel around the Philippines and to explore it in order to really appreciate what a beautiful country and a beautiful people we really are. I will even have to say I've worked as a priest in different countries, and I will tell you, and I feel a little ashamed telling you this, but I will tell you, there are no people in the world who love their priests the way Filipinos love their priests. And I think this is always one of the best countries in the world to be a priest in. Now, I'm telling this to you about the way I grew into being the Filipino that I am now, simply because I think the way I came to the realization of what a beautiful country the Philippines is and what a beautiful people we are, basically reflects our journey also of faith. When I was a student up in Boston, I remember when some of the teachers and professors found out I was a Catholic priest, and they would approach me and ask me about that. I would sometimes ask them, "Are you a Catholic?" And it was only in Boston where for the first time I heard the response when I asked people, "Are you a Catholic?" They would not say yes or no. They would simply say, "I was raised Catholic." I never heard that response before. But I came to understand that answer, "I was raised Catholic," was almost like a disclaimer that yes, I grew up in a Catholic family, I was raised by Catholic parents, and yet I do not practice Catholicism anymore. And this for me is really the struggle that we have as Christians, as Catholics. That I would, for example, meet Catholic parents who would come to me worried that their children are thinking of transferring to a different religion. And I would often ask the parents who come to me regarding that, I would often ask them, have your children explored this religion, the Catholic faith first? Because I honestly believe that if you know the Catholic faith, you would never, never honestly leave it. This is the struggle that you and I have, even we priests have, with regard to the faith that we are all born into. We think that it's so familiar simply because we have been surrounded by Catholic parents, Catholic lolos and lolas, Catholic brothers and sisters, Catholic aunts and uncles, and because it is so familiar, we think we know everything about the Catholic faith, when actually we do not. And sometimes because of this, we search the whole world for religion, we search for it elsewhere, without even first exploring this faith that you and I are born into. Sometimes, this arrogance that we have with regard to our faith, sometimes manifests itself as either indifference or sometimes outright hostility. Even I as a priest, I will tell you, there was a certain point in my priesthood when I also carried that arrogance that because I was a priest, I thought I knew everything about the faith. Only to realize that when I learned to pray again, I really knew such a small portion of our faith. It was only when I learned to pray again that I realized there was still so much more about our Catholic faith. Now, The gospel today is about the Epiphany. The Epiphany is the mystery of Christ manifesting himself to the world, manifesting himself to the Gentiles. If the Jewish faith was for the Jewish people, because they were the chosen people, Christianity, which is the perfection of the Jewish faith, was a more universal religion. It was no longer just for the Jews, but for all. That's why it's wonderful that in the Epiphany, we see the story of the Magi, who represents the non-Jews, and also the story of the shepherds, who represent the Jews coming to pay homage to the King, who was born no longer just for the Jews, but for the whole world. And Epiphany and the Feast of the Epiphany that we celebrate today is precisely that. How Christianity is now manifested not just to the Jewish nation, but to the whole world, to the Philippines. Especially now that we celebrate 500 years of Christianity, that should be quite significant for us. However, as we also know in the story of the gospel, the Jews were unaware. Here were strangers from another land, the Magi, asking for where the Messiah was born, and the Jews were unaware. They were so familiar with their faith. They were very, very familiar with the prophecy with regard to the coming Messiah. And yet, because they were so familiar, they were indifferent to the prophecy. They were indifferent to the signs of the times. They were not paying attention. And because of that, when the Magi came and asked, where is the king? Because we have seen his star, and nagkagulo sila. In fact, we see the reaction. They did not know that the star of the promised Messiah had already come out, which showed an indifference, because they thought they were so familiar with their Jewish religion, they were so familiar with the messianic prophecy that they did not really pay attention, and they were just basically indifferent about the whole thing. But second, when the Magi approached Herod and told him that they were looking for the Messiah, they were looking for the king, because they saw his star, what was the reaction of Herod? Herod's reaction in the gospel today was this: he was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Can you imagine when they found out that the king who was prophesied by the prophets was finally born? Instead of rejoicing, they were troubled. In short, if some Jews were indifferent to the prophecy, Herod and his cohorts were hostile to the prophecy. So hostile that Herod eventually would slaughter the innocents because of the threat of this newborn king. Brothers and sisters, this is the struggle of our time. The struggle to rediscover the faith that you and I were born into. Even I as a priest had to rediscover this faith I was born into. Being raised Catholic does not necessarily mean we know the Catholic faith. That's why it is incumbent upon us to get to know this faith, to study it very well, to try to understand it. In short, to rediscover this faith we were all born into, and hopefully to deepen it. Now, notice that in the gospel, and in previous gospels, the Magi, as well as the shepherds, were only able to see the light of God's star at night. They were only able to discern the light of God in darkness, which is an irony, right? That they saw the light of God in darkness. And I have often looked at this, at least in my personal experience, as the darkness that I experience in prayer. I have told you before that sometimes our experience of prayer is one of darkness. And yet in that darkness, the light, the star of God shines. And we simply have to spend that time in prayer in order to discern that light. Notice that Jerusalem and the Jews never noticed it. And yet in the darkness of the night, the Magi and the shepherds found the child. Similarly, brothers and sisters, it is only in the darkness of prayer that we can discover more of this God, of this faith that we were born into. And it is and the time that we invest in it allows us to see this faintest of God's light. Therefore, do not get discouraged by the dark that meets us during prayer. God is in that darkness too, just as God's light was in the darkness of the night skies that the Magi looked at in order to find the child. In conclusion, being born and raised Catholic does not a Catholic make. There is a thick fog that we as Catholics are born into, are surrounded with regard to this faith. And this thick fog we are surrounded with is the thick fog of false familiarity. We need to break through this fog of false familiarity and rediscover this faith that you and I have been so fortunate to be born in. One of the best tools for doing so, after studying our faith, after listening to people preach about our faith, after reading about our faith, one of the best and most powerful ways of doing so is to pray. And I will assure you, for those who constantly and regularly pray, your efforts will always be fruitful. I've often wondered when I read the life of Saint Teresa, how Teresa at different times in her life would just repeatedly always thank God for making her a Catholic. And now I know, because if you only discovered your faith more deeply, if you only understood what the Catholic faith really is all about, I will assure you, you will never ever want to leave it at all. May this grace of the Epiphany, of this light shining in the darkness, of God manifesting Himself no longer just to the Jewish nation, but to all peoples, including the Philippines. And we have 500 years of that to attest to. May this grace of light in the darkness during this Epiphany be the light that will lead us to a much deeper love for this faith that you and I have been very fortunate to be born into. Amen.